Hey everybody, I hope you guys are doing well. Juan back here again with a new video, and as always, very excited to get to sit down with you guys to talk about more sports creative content. First of all, a big thank you to everybody who has subscribed over the last few weeks. We have hit 200 plus subscribers on this channel, and I could not be more thankful and more happy for all of you guys who decided to support me on this journey. I think I've said it before, I didn't think I would go to a channel to this size, so as always guys, thank you so much. And if you guys are new here and you guys are enjoying my content, make sure to subscribe. I'm coming out with a ton of new content over the next few weeks for you guys as well, so please consider subscribing. It would be much appreciated. For today's video, I want to talk about one of the most important topics when it comes to shooting sports, and that is frame rates. I think frame rates are one of the most important concepts to get comfortable with as a sports videographer, especially because it can drastically change the way your video is edited and viewed depending on what frame rates you're using it and when you're using them. If you guys are new to the video world and aren't really sure what a frame rate is essentially how many frames or stills there are in 1 second of video. And essentially, the more frames you have, the more you can stretch out and slow a particular clip. The way this kind of works is that video is actually just several stills or photos essentially stitched together to simulate and recreate movements in a video. Before getting into the frame rates though, I want to talk about one thing, and that is the 180-degree shutter rule. This rule essentially states that whatever frame rate you're shooting at, you're gonna want your shutter speed to be 1 over double that frame rate. So let's say you're shooting 24 frames per second, you're gonna wanna make sure your shutter speed is set to 1 over 50 or 1 over 48, depending on the camera you have. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, you're shooting 1 over 125, and so on and so on. This rule kind of just ensures that no matter what frame rate you're shooting, there's always a bit of a natural motion blur, and it's not too disorienting for the audience. There are certain cases where, yeah, you can definitely overcrank or undercrank your shutter and get a lot of different effects and looks, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to assume all these frame rates are shot using the 180-degree shutter rule. I know there's also a lot of differences between frame rates here and in Europe. I'm in North America and Canada, so I'm just going to talk about the frame rates I normally use and why I use them. To start off, let's talk about 24 frames per second. 24 frames per second is one of the most commonly used frame rates in film and cinematography. This frame rate is fantastic if you want to replicate the natural motion blur you see with your eyes, and it's also one that will be easiest for your audience members to view without being disoriented. As a sports videographer, there is definitely a time and a place to use 24 frames per second, but it isn't what I normally use, especially to shoot high action sports. There are a lot of upsides to 24 frames per second, and a lot of filmmakers love using it because of the natural look. However, there are a few downsides, especially when shooting sports. The only downside I see to using 24 frames per second in sports is the fact that you can't slow down your footage at all. Slow motion footage is one of the biggest assets and tools I use when using my sports videos, and if I shoot a highlight in 24 frames per second, that's fantastic, but if I ever want to slow it down, I'm gonna have a hard time because there just isn't enough information in that clip for me to slow it down. But if there is moments you want to capture at regular speed, then it would 100% benefit you to shoot in 24 frames per second, especially if you know you're not gonna slow it down at all. Also, if you shoot interviews or any type of talking head or wherever a subject is speaking, definitely consider using 24 frames per second. This is just to ensure that the lips of your subject and the words that they're saying synchronize very well. It's kind of off-putting to see interviews shot in 60 or 120 frames per second, so my recommendation to you, if you're doing a talking head, kind of like a YouTube video or a feature interview, make sure you shoot in 24 frames per second. It'll just give you a way more natural and pleasing look. 60 frames per second is one of the most commonly used and probably one of the most popular frame rates in sports and in general right now, mostly because of the fact that you can slow down this footage up to 40% of its original speed. Shooting at this frame rate can allow you to shoot a very smooth, slow motion image, giving it a very dramatic and cinematic feel, so it's a great way to get started in shooting slow motion. And I think 60 frames per second is arguably the most flexible frame rate out there for several reasons. One reason being that the majority of cameras in the market right now, especially entry-level or beginner level cameras, do have the ability to shoot 60 frames per second. And like I said, due to it being accessible, it's definitely a great entry point for anybody who wants to start shooting slow motion footage, and it's pretty much the best middle ground between something like 24 frames per second and some of the higher frame rates like 120 frames. When you play 60 frames per second footage at 100%, it isn't as smooth or as natural as 24 frames per second, but it isn't jarring enough for the audience members to notice the drastic change in, the frame rate or the look of the video. And there's a lot of opportunities for you to, use it as a middle ground where you might want to shoot players, for example, in a locker room waiting before a game or listening to a coach talk, or you might want to get a speech from the coach in that same room and you might not have time to switch to 24 or to switch your settings. But at the same time, if you can shoot 60, you can keep it at 100% speed and not really throw off your viewers or have it look too different. This gives me a lot of flexibility in post-production and really, allows me to get away with playing something at a higher frame rate at full speed, which with higher frame rates, you can't necessarily do all the time. I use it a lot for pre-game and post-game looks if you want to add a little bit of drama and slow it down just a tad, or as well in the locker room, like I mentioned, it is a great frame rate to shoot at, especially if you want a slow motion shot of someone getting ready for a game or something along those lines. 120 frames per second is definitely my favorite frame rate for so many reasons, and I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I think at least 90% of my footage that I have archived over the last several years has been shot at 120 frames per second. The biggest reason for it is that you can slow 120 frames per second footage down to 20% of its original speed. Also, when it's fully slowed, you get a significant reduction in any camera shakes or little micro jitters that you might get and that you would see with something like 24 frames per second. And honestly, as a sports videographer, there is nothing more satisfying than getting that perfect dunk or that perfect goal hit celebration in nice, buttery smooth 120 frames per second slow motion. I think when I started shooting sports and I had a camera like the A6300 that could shoot 120 frames per second, that was just one of the most satisfying things for me. It's just capturing those moments and being able to slow it down and enjoy it and have the audience enjoy it in all its glory. Another thing about 120 frames per second footage, when you're shooting, there might be moments that you may not think look great at full speed, but when you slow them down to 20%, you're gonna be surprised how many extra little nuggets and pieces you're gonna get from action, moments on the bench or players' emotions. Just by slowing down a clip a little bit, a clip you might normally use, you might find something that you wouldn't have normally picked up if it was a different frame rate. This is just a rule of thumb for me, but personally, I like shooting sports at the highest frame rate available to me, purely because it gives me the most flexibility when I bring my footage into post and I can start crafting my final product. I think 120 frames per second should be an asset all sports filmmakers use in one way or another, because I think it's a really good visual asset for storytelling. It's key for slowing down the pace of your edits or speeding up the pace of your edits using something like speed ramps, or if you're trying to showcase a particular moment and you want to really slow it down and let the audience feel it, whether it's a big goal or a celebration, and just you want to slow it down and freeze time as much as you can to give it more of a dramatic feel. And so I personally love that about 120 frames per second, just the ability to stretch out those moments and make them last a little longer. I think what I just mentioned is the 100% the biggest reason why I shoot 120 frames most of the time. Doesn't matter if it's soccer, hockey, basketball, volleyball, it is my go-to frame rate for shooting sports. And I know a lot of people are probably like, wait, why are you shooting everything at 120 frames per second? It looks terrible fully sped up. You're kind of right. 120 frames per second footage does look a lot jittery and a lot more shaky at full speed, but at the same time, if you're editing in a 24 frames per second timeline, that adds a little bit of stability to it. And honestly, you don't always need to keep your shots in slow motion, and I kind of like the look of a fully sped 120 frames per second shot. It just gives it a little bit more character, and it's just something I've always gotten used to, and no one's really called me out for it yet. But 120 frames per second, my most used frame rate without a doubt. It is something I use day in and day out, and it is one of the most valuable tools in my arsenal, and I recommend you give it a shot if you haven't yet. 240 frames is definitely a big step, and it's a whole other world in comparison to these other frame rates. Now, this is a frame rate I really haven't shot a lot of because it's not generally available on most cameras, and I didn't really have access to it until upgrading my camera to the A7S III. Now, 240 frames per second is a whole other world of slow motion. Especially for me, it's something I haven't really experimented with, mostly because my camera up until this point couldn't shoot 240 frames per second up until I got the A7S III, and even though I've had this camera for a few months now, I haven't been able to shoot live sports in a couple of months because of the COVID outbreak and the lockdown we're currently in here in Ontario. Luckily, right before we went into lockdown, I did get one opportunity to test the 240 frames per second on the A7S III, and the results were really surprising for me because it was the first time I ever played with footage that slow. 240 frames per second footage can be slowed down to 10% of its original speed. That is 8 times slower than normal. And man, it is crazy to see how slow and crisp this footage looks fully slowed down, and it's kind of disappointing that as of right now, there still aren't many consumer level cameras that can shoot this frame rate. I thought 120 frames per second was slow, but after seeing the 240 frames per second footage, I'm still surprised at how slow and how smooth this looks. And to consider, I just shot a practice with that. I have yet to use it in an actual game scenario. Personally, I think I'll keep shooting most of my sports content in 120 frames per second footage purely because I think 240 frames can be a bit too slow at times, but it definitely has its place in my repertoire. It is definitely a tool I'm gonna use it here and there, and I can't wait to mix it into some of my videos in the future. Just to wrap this up, I want you guys to understand that frame rates are simply a tool that you guys can use to enhance or change up the way you're visually gonna tell a story. I don't want you guys leaving here thinking that the best thing to do is always shoot 120 or always shoot 60 or always shoot 240. I think it's important that you guys find what works for you and mix and match and experiment with all the different frame rates, because they can all produce pretty different results. It won't make or break your video, but I think it can really change the way you enhance and visually impact your audience. I know a lot of people out there are gonna be like, you should use 24 frames per second here, or you should never always shoot 120 frames per second, blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, guys, you guys are the creatives. It is your piece of content. You guys have the end goal in mind. These are just tools and means to get to that point. And ultimately, whatever you guys decide to shoot in will be the best for your final product. I'm 100% sure of that. I would love to know, guys, what are the frame rates that you guys are using? What's your favorite frame rate right now? Leave it down in the comments below. I would love to see how you guys are using it in your sports content. As always, if you guys have taken anything from this video, if you learned anything, if you guys enjoyed it, please leave it a like. And if you haven't subscribed yet, if you guys are new, or if you've been around and haven't hit that button down there, please do so. I would really appreciate it. I am loving the growth this channel is having, and I'm more motivated than ever to come out with content for you guys. But as always, that's it for this video, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.